in the audience today. Feel free to use the chat function to share your name, your affiliation, where you're tuning in from. We'd love to hear from all of you coming in from the waiting room.
Rise.
Welcome, folks. So nice to have so many of you with us here today to learn more about revitalizing communities through historic restoration.
What?
If you can mute yourselves, we're hearing a little background noise. Thanks so much. And feel free to share your name, affiliation, where you're tuning into from the chat. We'd love to hear. Welcome everyone. We've got lots of folks tuning in from New Bedford. Love seeing someone, Dawn from Northampton. I grew up in Western Mass, so great to have you here with us today. Previous innovator, Andy Hurley from Community Boating. Thanks so much for joining us. And I see Helena, one of our big SIF supporters. Thanks so much for making the time today. All right. Well, I think I'm going to get us started here. Welcome to the folks who have just joined us from the waiting room. Again, feel free to use that chat box to share who you are, where you're tuning in from. All right, well, I'm going to get us started here. So welcome everyone. My name is Sarah Dingy. I'm a program manager at the Social Innovation Forum, and we are so excited to be here with all of you today to learn more about the importance of revitalizing communities through historic restoration. And I'm so thrilled to be here with all of you to learn more about this topic and to specifically hear about the historic restoration efforts that are happening in the city of New Bedford. And because we are on Zoom together, I want to begin with just a few nuts and bolts. We ask that folks please mute your microphones, but we encourage you to participate in the chat function at any time during the session. And we will be using the chat for questions during the Q&A portion, so feel free to jump in and ask your questions there. And an SIF team member will be monitoring that during that time. And we also want to let folks know that this session is recorded and it will be shared with everyone after the event. First, I'd like to give a special thanks to the Schraft Charitable Trust for the support of the track focused on revitalizing New Bedford through community-based efforts. I'd also like to take a moment to recognize WHALE, Waterfront Historic Area League. The WHALE team continued their everyday work while completing the most intensive parts of SIF's accelerator, which we know in a normal year is extremely demanding. And this, of course, has not been a normal year. So we really appreciate WHALE and the whole 2020 cohort staying with SIF and working extremely hard during these last few months. They remain deeply engaged with SIF as they actively worked to strengthen their capacity to connect and uplift their communities in a time of really great need. And we're so grateful for all of their work. And finally, I'd like to give a thanks to the SIF team for being nimble and adapting to working remotely these days, which we all know has not been simple, particularly for an organization such as ours that really thrives on personal connection. We had to pause this series back in March of 2020, and we are really pleased to be back together for our third virtual social issue talk. And of course, we're so grateful to our speakers today, Mary Anthony, Teri Bernert, Kathryn Duff, and Denise Porche for joining us, and we look forward to hearing from them very soon. But before we start, I'd like to just share a bit more about the Social Innovation Forum for those who might not know about our work. The mission of the Social Innovation Forum is to create positive social change in Greater Boston and beyond by engaging leaders, strengthening organizations, and building networks. And we do this by engaging and informing funders and investors about social issues and also about the most promising solutions to those social issues, helping to create avenues for directing resources most effectively for real impact. You'll see on the other side of our work, the nonprofits we work with, we provide technical support to leaders of nonprofit organizations like Whale to help them build capacity so they can deliver the most effective solutions to social issues. As you can see, SIF sits in the middle of these two groups. We are intentionally making connections to build relationships across diverse communities of people on both sides of the equation, so we can help each other generate significant social change. We like to think of our work as taking a marketplace approach to social change, where SIF is creating the marketplace and inviting people in with all sorts of skills, resources, connections, expertise, and needs, and helping them to make connections, to leverage their strengths, and to learn from one another. And by being here today, all of you are part of this marketplace. So we hope that you'll learn from the experts today and consider finding ways to support our nonprofit leaders who are on the ground tackling really important social issues. So on to the real reason why you've all come here today. I'd like to introduce Mary Anthony, Executive Director of the 1772 Foundation, a foundation committed to ensuring the safe passage of historic buildings and farmland to future generations. Under Mary's guidance and leadership, the 1772 Foundation became a national leader in the field of historic properties redevelopment programs. In May of 2016, Mary was the recipient of the prestigious Paul E. Tsongas Award for Preservation from Preservation, Massachusetts. This award celebrates the exceptional vision, leadership, and accomplishments of women in historic preservation. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Mary Anthony.
Thanks so much, Sarah. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. Just take 1 second. There we go. Thank you so much for having me today. As Sarah said, I'm Mary Anthony. I'm the Executive Director of the 1772 Foundation, and we are based in Providence, Rhode Island. But I'm talking to you today from Pomfret, Connecticut, where I've been for the past few months, like you, working from home. I joined the foundation in 2003, and that was very soon after the death of our founder, Stuart Barney Kane. Stuart was from Elizabeth, New Jersey, and he named the foundation after his beloved home, which was called Liberty Hall, and it was built in 1772. The foundation was originally formed in 1985 to ensure safe passage of historic buildings and farmland to future generations. And upon Stuart's death, the foundation received an $80 million bequest. So we went from being a $2 million foundation to an $80 million foundation virtually overnight. Although we're based in Rhode Island, we do work all over the country. In the early days of the foundation's growth, we struggled a bit with the idea of historic preservation as a standalone field, and historic preservation is our mandate. We had a hard time figuring out where was the human impact and how did it make the world better. We were lucky early on to meet Lee Adler, who had served as president of the Historic Savannah Foundation in Georgia. And through him, we learned that there were entrepreneurial groups around the country that were practicing proactive preservation that we thought was worth exploring, called revolving funds or historic properties redevelopment programs. And we learned from him that in places like Savannah, Charleston, Pittsburgh, Providence, Knoxville, and Macon, Georgia, there were dedicated preservationists who were boldly crossing a line. So unlike traditional preservationists with whom we had worked in the early days, who sort of reacted to development, historic properties redevelopment or revolving fund directors were taking on the role of real estate developer themselves. So they were buying or optioning historic properties. They were ensuring their ongoing protection through protective language in the property deed. They were stabilizing or even fully restoring buildings, and then they were putting them into the hands of appropriate owners to steward. The money from each transaction was revolved, and the proceeds were used to fund subsequent preservation revolutions. And I should say that many of our revolving funds joke that they're devolving funds because they do tend to lose money over time. We were immediately struck with the importance of this methodology we learned about in Savannah. Moving at the speed of the marketplace allows funds and programs to have a highly leveraged impact, so the multiplier effect is substantial. Advanced programs like those in Charleston, Savannah, and Providence have saved hundreds of buildings through bold and decisive action. So we were really inspired by these groups, and we've been committed to revolving funds since that first meeting with Lee Adler. And our involvement takes on many forms. We fund and we present in conjunction with the National Main Street Center and the National Development Council 2 weeks of training for preservationists in real estate finance and real estate deal structuring. We support feasibility studies and business plans, as well as seed money for emerging revolving funds. We always fund, except for this year was virtual, a national convening of revolving fund directors, featuring educational sessions and guest speakers who help attendees learn more about the intersection of properties, work, and preservation. And we provide recapitalization and capital grants for active programs. We also now make program-related investments, and we've been doing this now for about 6 years, which are low interest loans to highly experienced revolving funds. They in turn loan the funds out for preservation work, repay us, and then we loan the money out again. So in that way, 1772 Foundation actually has a revolving fund for revolving funds. In all of the funds we've explored, and we do these all over the country, we've worked with 65 revolving funds to date. They involve preservation groups who are willing to be proactive, using the resources and opportunities available to each. There's always a common strategy of controlling a real estate deal long enough to give preservation a seat at the table. In North Carolina, projects include the restoration of a mill building, which is, I think, 200,000 square feet of vacant space that had been abandoned for over 20 years. In Boston, we've seen New Markets tax credits help close the financing gap on buildings that their revolving fund, Historic Boston, Inc., which is known as the developer of last resort, only they could successfully revolve it. On Defusky Island, Georgia, Gullah cottages are being protected using a long-term lease vacation rental model. And in Charleston, the nation's first revolving fund is now exploring, I think we call it their Revolving Fund 3.0, which will work closely with neighborhood groups to save freedmen's cottages for workforce housing, working closely with a community land trust. The Macon, Georgia fund arranged down payments to be provided on bungalows for a nearby university that found it was cheaper to provide this down payment assistance and have folks walk to work than it was to build a parking lot for them as commuters. And in that same city, loft apartments are being developed on second floors downtown, which is bringing young people back to the city core. And they did this by providing fire detection and suppression equipment, which was keeping those second floors from being used. We have worked, or we are working with citywide revolving funds from Galveston, Cleveland, Detroit, Mobile, Savannah, Charleston, New York City, Boston, DC, and New Bedford. We also work with state revolving funds in Connecticut, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Maine, Vermont, South Carolina, New York, North Carolina, Ohio, Wyoming, Mississippi, Pennsylvania, and Indiana. I'm elaborating on the scope of our work, not just to sort of illustrate what we do and our commitment to and passion for this particular kind of preservation, but also because I'm in a really interesting position where I get to visit all of these programs around the country. And I hear from many of them that they want to be like the big five. They want to be as good as the big five. And the big five includes Whale and New Bedford and Teri Bernert. And you'll be hearing more from Teri in just a minute. I want to finish on a quick note on the state of the field of historic preservation in this country. As a standalone field, it's really struggling. And I've identified 7 tensions that have emerged over my 17 years as a funder in this field. Preservation should be locally driven, proactive, for everyone, collaborative, people-centered, for the future, and it should be leading in the climate crisis. But the perception and sometimes the reality is that it's programmed from the top down, it's reactive, it's perceived as elitist, isolated from other fields, centered on buildings rather than people, and fixed in the past, and perceived as an impediment to the environmental movement. I think what Teri and Whale do is in the should column, and I think we're really so pleased to support them for this reason. They are locally driven, proactive, for everyone, collaborative, people-centered, for the future, and they acknowledge the climate crisis. So the impact that they have on their communities are great, and what the impact Teri has on her community is a great antidote to the real and perceived barriers that we see that are threatening the historic preservation movement as a whole. So not only are they doing great things in New Bedford, but I think they're also acting as an example to some of the groups around the country who really look to them for leadership. So I'm going to wrap this up and hand it back to the Social Innovation Forum to introduce Teri Bernert and Whale. But thanks for letting me talk a little bit about what the 1772 Foundation does and why we do it. Thanks.
Wonderful. Mary, thank you so much. It's so helpful for us to have an understanding of, the national landscape of this work. So thank you so much. And now I'd like to introduce Teri Bernert, Executive Director of Whale, the Waterfront Historic Area League. Teri has over 25 years of experience in community and economic development, concentrating in real estate development. Teri holds a master's in urban planning from George Washington University and is also an adjunct professor teaching adaptive reuse real estate feasibility at Roger Williams University. Please join me in welcoming Teri Bernert.
Hi, everyone. Mary, thanks. It's so nice to hear your overview and all the work that's going on around the country. And your 1772 support has been critical to Whale's growth over the last 8 years. So we thank you for your strong partnership. And thank you to SIF. It's been, and the Schraff Foundation for supporting Whale as an innovator this year. As Sarah said, it's been challenging with COVID and doing it virtually, but it's been such a rewarding process. And a lot of the people that have helped Whale as an innovator are listening right now. So thank you to you all for your support. It's been a great year. So 6 years ago, Whale became a certified community development corporation, which was very special. It made us the first and only historic preservation focused CDC in the country that we know about. And as Mary has said, we focus on finding new and creative reuses for vacant and deteriorated historic buildings to uplift and revitalize the community. We do put the people and our partners first over the buildings, but it all works together. And to date, we have restored over 70 buildings in Wales history. We definitely have a community development approach as a CDC to historic restoration. We identify vacant, next slide. We identify vacant and dilapidated historic buildings. And Kathryn will show you some of these. Here you see Howland House, in danger of foreclosure or demolition, in disinvested and low-income neighborhoods. We then engage the community, and I see some of our project partners are listening in as well. So our partnerships with nonprofits especially are super important, and we work with them in a feasibility process to determine the best and needed reuse for the buildings, and to make sure that it's going to be a financially viable and community engaging reuse of the building. Then we work with the restoration team, including architects, and you'll hear from Kathryn Duff of S2S, who's an architect on many of our projects, engineers and project partners to incorporate sustainable and green building practices while we are designing the Historic Restoration Act and to the Secretary of Interior standards for the buildings. Then we assemble, next slide. Then we assemble a wide variety of resources, including grants, historic tax credits, and private philanthropy, as well as other sources to put the project financing together. And then we undertake the actual historic restoration work, including construction management. You saw we all wear our pink hard hats. This probably is one of my favorite parts of the work, is actually being in the buildings, doing the construction. And the result is the transformation of the building, giving it a whole new life and new stories, and which leads to revitalized neighborhood with instilled community pride. So you see here, and Kathryn will show you this Hillman Firehouse, which is our big project for 2021 for 8 apartments. So that's our process, and Kathryn's going to go over some of our actual projects to give you a picture of this revitalization community development work. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Teri, thank you so much. Thank you for your partnership in SIF and for all the work that you and the team are doing in New Bedford right now. So I'd like to pass it to Kathryn Duff, who is the founder and director of Studio to Sustain S2S, an architecture practice committed to sustainable solutions, embracing ecology, economy, and equity. Prior to S2S, Kathryn was the founder of Studio of Architecture and Art, an architecture practice celebrating form and function in our coastal ocean region. Kathryn is chair of the City of New Bedford Planning Board and a member of the Whale Board of Directors and founding member of the Reach Foundation Board of Directors as well. Please join me all in welcoming Kathryn Duff.
Okay, thank you so much. It's really an honor to be here. I feel as though I'm among leaders of leaders, and it's really a great feeling and very celebratory. So the most sustainable building is the one that already exists. And Whale starts each project from this premise. So the following slides are really just the eyes on the ideas, the strategies, and the processes presented by my colleagues. I'm going to cover 4 projects, all of varying scope and reuse, but all playing a critically important role in revitalizing underserved sections of our community. The first is the Co-Creative Center. This was an urban block, a corner of an urban block. In the end, we realized it was actually 7 buildings that had been cobbled together over many years. And it was restored into a mixed-use center of co-work, co-learn, co-create, and housing. What started out as a building in terrifically terrible condition, which you see on the lower left slide, was renovated into a vibrant center of co-creation and housing as well, and is now a vibrant corner in our downtown area. The interesting aspect of the co-creative center is that it sits at a vibrant intersection and had been abandoned for many, many years before Whale got involved. But one really important aspect of this project is that it incorporates state-of-the-art building science. This is the piece of sustainability that we rarely talk about because you really don't see it. Once it gets covered up, it's covered up. But it's really critically important to saving these buildings. So we implement techniques that meet state-of-the-art air testing, air tightness, insulation techniques, and these enable these buildings to have another life of several hundred years. They also defer maintenance costs, they save the energy, they reduce the carbon footprint because they simply use less energy to actually operate. In addition to all of the carbon footprint reduction in working with existing buildings and not demolishing them. The next project is 318 Pleasant Street, and I want you to just hold this image for a second in your mind. So this was the condition of this abandoned Greek Revival two-family house when Whale got involved. It was in really, really rough shape, had a massive hole in the roof, and it had been abandoned and was absolutely filled to, as we say in New Bedford, the gunnels, with junk on the inside. It took 7 dumpster loads to empty the building before we could even begin our work of restoring it. And when we look at a project like this, we assemble a team. It takes a whole team just to establish the scope of something like this. We get roofers involved, we get structural engineers involved, we get the community involved, the neighbors involved. This is in a terrifically underserved section of New Bedford, and it was renovated and restored into a two-family project, a two-family home, which is now the home of a single mother and her daughter and her family. And these are never easy projects. It really requires a village to make these projects a success. And now this building's been turned back into the neighborhood from which it came. The next project, also an abandoned Greek Revival home, a bit bigger, up on a hill, same street, but down the road a ways, a couple miles, also in an very underserved section of the city. This project came to Whale through the receivership program, which in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts is through the Attorney General's office and the city of New Bedford. But this time, instead of renovating the project into a home, Whale partnered with the Veterans Transition House organization and restored the project into housing for 20 veterans. In addition to being housing for 20 veterans, it also houses on the ground floor, which we were able to restore, an office for the Veterans Transitional House. And on the first and second floor, there's a programming space, group programming space. So in addition to 20 veterans, they have group programming space and office space for the VTH organization. The project came online in March of 2020, and we all know what happened then. It was on the eve of COVID hitting us, and this building actually was certified and opened as a quarantine site for COVID, for veterans testing positive for COVID. So when we went to go get the CO to occupy the building, we actually spent 2 weeks and got a certificate from the Board of Health to open as a quarantine site. And that was with the mayor's urging. And here's a little sampling of the rooms on the inside. Every square inch of this building was renovated and occupied, including 2 bedrooms and bathrooms up on the 3rd floor. And lastly, I want to talk about 109 Hillman Street. This is the firehouse at 109 Hillman Street that was in the lovely images at the beginning of Teri's talk. This is a really important building, late Victorian era, standalone masonry building. It was the civil defense building for the city of New Bedford. It's in also an underserved section of the city Whale has taken this on, partnering with the city of New Bedford, and we're going to renovate this building into 8 housing units, most of them being affordable and workforce housing. I will say about masonry buildings, they're really, really hard projects. They require a comprehensive team to save them and to restore them. And they really require state-of-the-art building science to make certain and ensure that they're able to accommodate uses for the next 200 years. Wales put together a team that's currently stabilizing the building. That includes steel fabricators, masons, roofers, and carpenters. And that work is underway right now. This project has been pre-permitted in the city of New Bedford, and it's also received historic tax credits. And you can see, to get an idea of the vision of the project and what it's going to look like in the end. It's hard to see that from the existing photographs. And a sampling of some of the units. These will be fully accessible, handicap accessible units on the first floor. It's also very exciting to provide that for affordable housing. And so I just want to end with a giant thanks. This was a lot of fun putting these slides together and participating in this panel. These projects all have a heritage that is woven into the fabric of the community, the architectural, vernacular, and the economic heritage of the city. Whale gives these projects a future built on the past, but developing a new narrative, extending the heritage of the community, the building, and the economy of New Bedford. So thank you all very much.
Wonderful, Kathryn. Thank you. Thank you so much. It's really so wonderful to see these projects really come to life through the photos and to see all the unique and innovative ways these buildings can be restored for those in the community. So thanks so much. And now our last speaker, I'd like to introduce Denise Porche, Executive Director of the Island Foundation. Under her leadership, the Island Foundation has increased its funding for equity and inclusion, basic needs, and educational and work opportunities for those in underserved populations. Denise's leadership and philanthropy includes prior facilitation of the Greater New Bedford Funders Network and Exponent Philanthropy's local engagement group. Currently, she serves on boards of Philanthropy Massachusetts, Environmental Grantmakers Association, and the South Coast Community Foundation. Please all join me in welcoming Denise.
Thank you, Sarah, for that introduction. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Denise Porche. And I just want to talk a little bit about the Island Foundation and our work with Whale over the years. The Island Foundation is a private family foundation located in Marion. And we are now on the 3rd generation of the Board of Trustees. So it's been quite exciting to usher in those next generations during my tenure. And over the years, they focused on the city of New Bedford, the environment, women and girls, and alternative education. More than half of the 40 years that they've been in existence has been devoted to supporting projects in the city of New Bedford. And I believe that they wanted to support New Bedford, not just because they grew up nearby, but because they really truly value the cultures and the history in New Bedford. They also value the neighborhoods and the downtown area, and they want to provide their support to increase the vitality and the creativity in those spaces. They've been a longtime supporter of Whale, I believe, since 1996, and we've contributed about $500,000 to the organization. So truly, it's one that they have a lot of respect and admiration for. Speaking of respect, I've been really impressed during my tenure with both the leadership and the board of Whale. And I found them to have really the most boldest vision for their projects that I have ever seen with any organization. They work with spaces that, most would just simply ignore, and they really turn them into amazing entities. And they also support the growth, the economic growth for not just families, but for the city as well. During my tenure, I have also found Whale to be very welcoming. And that spirit is just, really the heart of the organization. And it's not just inviting you to the ribbon cutting ceremonies, but it's to the invites that you get to do the walkthroughs through crumbling brick and floorboards. That's the best part of Whale, walking through places. I can remember walking in with Kathryn and Teri, and I'm like, there are no lights, there are no electricities, and oh my gosh, I'm going to fall to the floor any minute. And they're going on and leading and talking about their vision. And, you really have to have a lot of respect for people who can see what the average person cannot see. And I've also worked with Whale and helped to support them when they brought in a national training organization to come to the city several years ago to work on how to reuse old houses of worship. They brought many nonprofits and different sectors to the table. And I can say that without a doubt, that was a very early example in the city of collaborative impact. So kudos to Whale for making that happen. I've also been impressed with the Co-Creative Center. I can remember early on getting a call from a donor and telling me, you have to get on board with this project. And when I asked her why, she said, because it's for women, and it's created by women, down from the architect to the builders, and you really have to get behind this. So again, going in, as you saw in the slides earlier from Kathryn, walking around that space and just imagining what it could be, and then seeing what, resulted was just phenomenal for downtown. And to get to talk to the individual female artists and the female entrepreneurs that just are thriving in that space, I think is really a testament to that vision that I spoke to earlier for Whale. And currently they are working with 2 abandoned theaters in the North End. And I'm so anxious to see how they get to revitalize those spaces, not just for the nonprofits involved, but for the business district as well. So can never say enough to champion, the efforts of Whale. And I thank you all for allowing me this opportunity to just give them some kudos at this time. So thanks.
Well, Denise, thanks so much. I'm going to move us now then into the Q&A portion of today's conversation. So we welcome folks to use the chat box to share any questions you have for our speakers today. And while we give folks a minute here, we do have a few questions ready in case our chat box was a little quiet to start. So I think I'm going to kick us off here. And this one is really directed to the folks at Whale. So it seems, that your organization has evolved in so many ways over the years. But, would love to hear more about what steps are being taken currently to continue, evolving the work and improving the organization.
Is that me?
Yes.
I can't stress enough the partnerships that we engage in for these projects. I see we have your theater on the Eric Paradise, but we're working with your theater for their Steeple Playhouse, working with the Cape Verdean Association for Island Park, and Strand Theater Restoration for a Cape Verdean Cultural Center, working with former innovator at CEDC, another CDC in New Bedford, on their economic mixed-use revitalization of Capitol Theater. And most recently working with the LGBTQ network on 68th Street to restore that downtown building for the first LGBTQ community center in the South Coast. So the partnerships are established, and we go through feasibility process and determine that the project's feasible. And we often do business planning with our project partners so that they, once we get the building restored, can successfully operate and provide the services to the community. So that's been Wales' growth model, and what's really been the most important element of our work over these past 8 years.
Wonderful. Teri, thanks so much. I'm actually going to drop Wales prospectus in the chat for folks who might want to learn more. This prospectus was a deliverable that was created in partnership with the Social Innovation Forum and lays out some of Wales' work. So feel free to check that out if you want to learn more. Wonderful. So I'm going to move us to another question that just came in from Eric. So are there any organizations that offer specific grants or rebates for energy saving additions to historic buildings or to nonprofits? This is around storm windows, installation, HVAC, etc. I think this might go to anyone.
I can speak to it in terms of state funded entities. So there's a lot of programs available for home ownership of historic buildings through the Clean Energy Center and the Mass Safe program. And the state has recognized that commercial buildings, and that also includes nonprofit developments like the work that Wales undergoes, that they've been left out of many of these programs. So they started rolling out programs they started with new construction, and it was hugely successful. And that pile of money was filled very quickly for multifamily affordable housing projects, applying for energy saving rebates and actually funds, outright grants for hitting certain energy saving criteria, mostly around passive house. But that because it was so successful, they started rolling out this year to nonprofits and to commercials, multifamily housing from renovations of existing structures. And they've started with the 3-family tenement house, which we have a big stock of in Massachusetts, and they'll move that up into mixed use buildings of existing buildings and other adaptive reuse. So stay tuned. I would check that CEC website. These programs are rolling out as we speak, and you're going to see more funds available for commercial and nonprofit mixed use developments.
Wonderful. Kathryn, thanks so much for jumping in there. I'm going to direct a question now to Mary. So Mary, you mentioned there's this big 5. At first I was thinking, a basketball lineup. But you mentioned that Wales is part of one of the big 5. Can you share who the other 4 organizations are?
Yes, but it cannot leave this room.
So I guess only if you're comfortable.
I think it moves around a lot, but you often see Providence Revolving Fund, Historic Boston, Preservation North Carolina, Historic Savannah, maybe I'll make it 6, the Georgia Trust. Those are all very high functioning revolving funds who have done really amazing work over the years, and they're worth checking out. Check out their websites to see what they're doing. And interestingly, I think the Georgia Trust has a program that might be of interest to Eric Paradise. He had the question about energy efficiencies. So they started a program with a group called South Face called Earthcraft, and it's a sustainable heritage program that does third-party certification to gauge energy efficiencies and the potential for renewable resources, renewable energy systems at historic sites. So we're doing 2 pilot programs, I hope this year, along those lines. It's really important for heritage sites to be involved in the environmental movement in a really meaningful way, but we need that third-party certification that's not as difficult as LEED to get to. So it might be worth checking out South Base Earthcraft. The Georgia Trust does use them, and that's why they're in the top 5. That's why.
Great, Mary, thanks so much for sharing that resource and also sharing those other groups. So this question I'm going to move into, I think could be for everyone, really, what's the most important impact historic preservation has to offer to a community?
Is that one to me?
I think any of our speakers could jump in on this.
Well, it's I guess Kathryn, do you want to take that one?
Can you just quickly recap that question?
Sure, of course, yeah. What is the most, really the most important impact, historic preservation has to offer for our community?
I think it's, in a nutshell, sustainability. And I mean that in the broadest sense, the contextuality, big, broad brush vision of sustainability, that you preserve a building. So every building has a heritage, and that heritage is connected to the community. So there's many, many stories attached to every building. And when you save that building and you preserve it, or you do an adaptive reuse, you renovate it, those stories just percolate throughout the community. So what was a story of the old building now becomes the foundation and the story of the next use, or the next tenant, or the next inhabitant of that building. So it begins by saving the building and allowing those stories to be told, to grow, to develop, and to expand. And I think that that's probably what I feel the most working on these projects, and what I hear from the community a lot. And I learn about, I know the technical aspects about buildings, but what I really appreciate learning about is the stories behind the buildings. And I often joke with Rachel Allison of Whale, who's one of the staff. She's on the call tonight. She's invaluable on these projects because she's the preservation authority on many of the buildings, that we should write a book and tell the stories behind the buildings, because they're just so rich on so many levels.
I would just also add that, and I know that 1772 is very supportive of, and other RLFs around the country have this strategy of looking for multiple projects in one area, so that the impact of the historic preservation is felt, and the spin-off of revitalization and community pride is really felt in one neighborhood that we're doing a lot of work in is the South End. And you saw the Howland House, that's now 7 apartments. We're currently finishing another restoration of a 2-family, and then we did 318. So that those projects coupled within a 2-block radius, that you see people painting their houses now, planting flowers. The city pays more notice to keeping the neighborhood clean, so that's the kind of cumulative impact when you're doing multiple projects.
I would just refer back to those 7 tensions too that I mentioned earlier. People want to live in character-rich neighborhoods. They want to live in walkable neighborhoods. They want them to be reflective of the culture and the history in the area where they live. They don't want it to be cookie cuttery. So there's that aspect too, that people prefer to live and work and play in character-rich neighborhoods and cities. And you can't do that with new construction all the time. It's been attempted many, many times, and there have been some really great examples of that. But old buildings are the best places for new ideas, as Jane Jacobs famously said. So it's really worth doing because people prefer it.
Great. Well, thank you all for jumping in there. And, just reflecting back, Teri, to that model graphic you shared, in one of your first slides, that one of the first pieces is community involvement, and would love just to share a little bit more of how you are bringing in folks from the New Bedford community, what their role is in the projects.
We try and have community meetings before projects. It's definitely something that we're continuing to try and do a better job at. Our goal this year is to hire a community outreach staff person to really facilitate community involvement in the projects, and also get into the neighborhood planning and working with the city, so that it's not just about the one or two buildings. It's about neighborhood revitalization and planning for it. So it's more comprehensive, but it's definitely something that we're going to be, we have focused on, but we're going to be really doing a much better job at. And one thing that we formed last year was called the Community Committee. And it's people on our board that are looking specifically at engaging community and community outreach. So that's a great question. It's something that we're really striving to do the best that we can, and work with the city and partners as we go along. I have to, the Island Foundation has, and Denise, I've had several phone calls with her about community engagement, and she's been a super big help with it.
I would also just add, building on what Teri just said, that the Co-Creative Center would have probably had a very different look had it not been for the early work with the community. We held lots of community charrettes, and the creative community showed up in force. And we learned so much from those community engagement workshops, we called them. And it really did help to contribute to defining the scope and the program and the end use of that building. And it took on a really different life as a result of those workshops with the community.
I would just like to jump in and say that when Mary spoke earlier about the tensions, and she says that, preservation needs to be for everyone and be collaborative. I think that example that Whale went through with the receivership program was one of, how does that get communicated? How does your work get communicated to the community at large so that there are no misunderstandings about the process? So while most people think something can just go from A to Z, I think the communication needs to happen like the devil's in the details. What about all the other letters of the alphabet? How does something come to be? And I think when you work on that communication to the public, then there's a better understanding and people are more willing to work with organizations.
Denise, thanks so much. And thank you to all of our speakers. We had another question that came in. I just want to share out here. So given the new focus on the potential for future viruses in the current pandemic, are there organizations that are giving assistance with upgrading things like HVACs with UV light systems?
I'm going to jump off of this call and jump onto a HVAC call with the Massachusetts Passive House community on that very subject. So it's probably the question my office fields the most these days. And we have a couple of clients that really need to upgrade their HVAC system, and it's very costly to do that, especially on a commercial building. So I would say that your best defense is a good design up front, so you're not playing catch up. But to date, right now, it's hard to get funds that will actually go directly towards the replacement of an HVAC system. So what we're finding is that it's very costly to replace these systems. So you're better off targeting one section of it and doing an upgrade to that one section, or adding extra ventilation as a separate system, just to increase the airflow in a building, and also to have what we call high filtration in those ventilation systems is a less costly way to go. But to date, don't really have direct funds that I know of, unless someone else on the call knows about some. This is the fun part of architecture, where we get to talk cubic flow of air.
I'm learning a lot today, Kathryn. Thanks so much for jumping in and answering that question here. All right, we are almost at time. Many thanks for those questions that came in. So I just want to thank our speakers today for joining us in such a rich and informative conversation about historic restoration and what's going on in the city of New Bedford right now. And we want to thank all of you for joining us here today. If you're interested in learning more about Whale, I encourage you to reach out to Teri and her team to schedule a call, a virtual coffee, when it's safe to do so and maybe a little warmer. New Bedford is beautiful. I hope you all take a trip down there at some point. So again, just want to thank you all for being here with us today. Thank our speakers, and of course, thank our track partner, the Schraft Charitable Trust, for all of their support. And we hope to see you all again real soon. Thanks so much, and take care.